I have a little story to tell, and one that Greg and I are rather proud of. Sitting to my immediate left is John McCullough, who is chair of the most illustrious film department in Canada, the York Film Department. And the last historical materialism conference that David was so central to organizing at York University, Greg and I went to that conference and looked at what was in the opening morning panel, and there was all this revolutionary stuff, mostly by our graduate students. And we saw that Scott Forsyth had organized a panel on film, and there was this very, very interesting title on the middle class in Hollywood. I think you had it on the, we just called this the middle class in Hollywood, but your paper title was, it was something to do with the decline of the middle class, or the crisis of the middle class, or the demise of the middle class in Hollywood. Or
no, it was still the middle class.
No, there was something. Anyway, it was I thought the best paper we heard at the historical materialism conference, and we grabbed it and asked John to write it up for this volume of the Register. I'm very proud to say that I insisted that he insert a section in it on The Apartment, the Academy Award-winning film on the proletarianization of insurance workers in 1960. I was an usher at a cinema that year, and when it won the Academy Award, I'd seen it so many times I felt I had won the Academy Award.
Thanks very much to Leo and Greg for picking up the paper at HM, and then for inviting me here and on the panel here with people who have really influenced me significantly. So I'm very honored to be here, and very generous introduction. Leo, thanks very much. I'm actually going to read from sections of the paper and drop down into bits and pieces of it, my extemporaneous skills being limited and in time being a premium here. But just to set it up, what I tend to do is do textual readings of popular culture. I stick to North America by and large, and I look at labor, I look at class relations and spatial relations, and typically within the context of Hollywood, we're talking always about happy endings and typical celebration of, and a triumphant celebration of middle-class values and capitalist values, and so it seems like a defeatist project to pursue some progressive or illuminating ideas about class relations within those texts, but I think they're quite striking. And what I've been really struck by is how the middle class is routinely situated as the most beleaguered class within class relations and within class struggle. And so that opens up some interesting doors that you can either dismiss that and say, well, that's not an accurate picture of reality, or you can kind of ask questions about what that middle class in Hollywood is actually constitute of. But the other thing too is to read it, I guess in a way that somebody like Frederick Jameson would read it, is that they're fully allegorical of more basic struggles within capitalism. But anyway, let me drop into the paper here. And it follows up nicely on Adolf's piece. By the late 40s and throughout the 50s, there's a significant rise in the numbers and popularity of stories that feature middle-class characters and plot crises. And their isolation from other class becomes particularly clear, as though the middle class was the totality of the world. And this effect has two sources, both stemming from fundamental changes in the American political economy after the Second World War, some of which Adolf mentions, actually. On the one hand, deindustrialization expanded the service sector, and thus by replacing the archetype of the worker as coterminous with the industrial shop floor, undermined the identity of working class people and organized labor. So then, as a category then, the working class became a less coherent and identifiable social formation. Also, this intensified control of the workplace in deindustrialization through technological innovation and new techniques of workplace rationalization and surveillance made even upper management jobs highly instrumentalized. Now, these trends encouraged the perception that the old working class was disappearing, being replaced by a salaried white-collar office employees or workers who were understood to be part of the middle classes. And I find that an interesting transformation. In Hollywood, it's this group that suffers the seeming relentless onslaught of social crisis, betrayal, exile, loss, injury, and seeming, and of course death. And while there are only a few popular Hollywood films about the working class after the 30s, the endless stream of images of the beleaguered middle provides stark lessons about the nuts and bolts of labor relations in capitalism, although never labeled as working class, and that's striking. Move on. After doing about a little bit of bumbling around in the 40s and 50s and Douglas Sirk melodramas, etc., I make a point about a more virile approach to superseding middle class crisis in the midst of modernity, as seen in The Fountainhead, which is 1949, featuring Gary Cooper, which turned Ayn Rand's novel and ethos into a working ideology for the leadership-driven and conformist middle classes seeking a place in American consensus culture of the time. So during the 50s, Cooper, Humphrey Bogart, Gregory Peck, Jimmy Stewart, Fred McMurray, Rock Hudson, and Richard Widmark all developed significant profiles as professionals and middle-class characters in crisis, which emerges almost as a genre within Hollywood, the professional in crisis. Katharine Hepburn, Barbara Stanwyck, and Doris Day stand out as female stars of the period who consistently escaped the domestic sphere as middle-class women. And the stereotypes of gender and class, gender and class representation of the period have been recently remediated in the hit cable TV series Mad Men, which provides contemporary audiences with an ironic and somewhat glib depiction of the class and gender relations of the later 50s and the early 60s. Now this is the part that Leo likes. A more radical approach to similar material is Billy Wilder's hugely popular and Oscar-winning The Apartment, which is rich in comic depictions of the stratified office place, the proletarianization of white-collar labor, and workplace exploitation. Jack Lemmon's C.C. Baxter is a lowly white-collar worker when his superiors discover he has a downtown apartment. He's in Manhattan. They coerce him to make his apartment available for their trysts, including providing alcohol and snacks and cleaning up after them, by implying that his compliance will help him gain an advantage against the 32,000 other cogs who work at Consolidated Life. He's ultimately rewarded with a promotion from a cog to a professional with an office and a crisis. And the film's crisp black and white visual design includes low, wide-angle shots of the expansive dropped ceiling, fluorescent lit modern office, emphasizing the rigidity of the hierarchy and the extreme level of proletarianization of this workplace. Now, Baxter's hope is that he's now moved fully out of the competitive drudgery of office work into professional autonomy and security. And nonetheless, the extortion continues. Bitter about his continued dispossession, Baxter begins to question his allegiances to his superiors and gradually recognizes himself as an exploited employee, not an ascendant bourgeois. So this is a comedy working as almost radical politics within the context of mainstream culture at the time. And jump on a little bit further. As is evident here, the constitutive identity of the middle class is diverse and difficult to delimit, as I was saying. And this has been an enduring theoretical problem in Marxist methodology. We see some of that problem represented in the movies. Everyone from narcissistic industrialists to sad-eyed savings and loans officers, Jimmy Stewart and It's a Wonderful Life, for instance, from doctors and then to low-ranking office workers. The American middle class is a grab bag of identities, associations, and social formations. But in the movies and on television, we tend to recognize the middle classes by the things that they own, if not immediately by the power they wield. And C.C. Baxter's apartment, for instance, signifies his middle class status on the one hand, but it also becomes, through his dispossession, it becomes, in fact, the very sign of his proletarianization. So objects within the middle class milieu become both something that are definitional, but also the central problem, ultimately. So, I'm going to jump on now from that period into the 80s and 90s. I've got time just to do that. So in the 80s and the 90s, media culture, youth and entrepreneurship are dominant themes, and teen comedies and yuppie horror, as two examples, are exemplary of this trend. And the teen comedy was almost single-handedly revived by John Hughes, whose films privileged the coming-of-age stories of white-bread, suburban, middle-class youth. Yuppie horror allegorically represented a variety of crises encountered by the young and upwardly mobile financial and entrepreneurial set favored by neoliberalism. In films like Fatal Attraction, and Pacific Heights, the horror at the center of the stories typically has its source in the mundane, or in a mundane middle-class life. So, for instance, in Fatal Attraction, central character has an office romance that goes dreadfully off the rails, and in Pacific Heights, the innocent new homeowners have to defend themselves against a terrifying and monstrous tenant and manipulative tenant. Even at the time, it was possible to read the monstrous co-worker or the tenant as reactionary responses to progressive changes, for instance, affirmative action hiring policies and tenants' rights legislation, and that in popular culture are routinely represented as oppressive interventions by the state and hence impediments to individual achievement. While highlighting this, the importance and the central importance of individualism in the period, several films and TV series created central characters who hyperbolically embody the core individual traits of the neoliberal personality: narcissism, self-aggrandizement, and zero-sum competitiveness. So we can think then of the most famous of these who gained iconographic status to be Tom Cruise, for instance, as Joel Goodson in Risky Business, or Ferris Bueller in Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Probably most famous, Gordon Gekko, played by Michael Douglas, who was the professional in crisis in the 80s and 90s, in Wall Street, and then Patrick Bateman in Bret Easton Ellis' novel, 1991 novel, American Psycho, which was played by Christian Bale in the 2000 film adaptation. So as seen in Pacific Heights and a variety of these films, home ownership remains a central concern for middle-class characters, and we see this trope in a variety of films, including, for instance, Poltergeist, in the haunted house, Indecent Proposal, where Woody Harrelson has to, like sells his wife to get his house, and he's an architect, so it's his dream house, and this is important. And Bamboozled, which is an interesting Spike Lee film about an ascendant African-American professional, played by Damon Wayans, who wants to hold on to this awesome pad he's got in Manhattan, and has to go through all the backflips to maintain it. All of which characterize homeowning as a battleground for middle-class status. And the image of the middle class in perpetual contestation is fully literalized by Fight Club, and not surprisingly, its story really begins when the central character's home is blown up. I'm going to finish up here on Fight Club, but I dropped down into a variety of different places, including visiting your home and region in Treme, and looking at the way that Katrina was handled by the U.S. media. It's a very interesting story to compare to the John Carpenter films, the escape films, where dispossessed populations are cordoned off from normal population, or the Gen Pop, and the images on the news around New Orleans and Katrina relief efforts were extraordinarily similar to that, almost scripted. It seemed to be kind of scripted as a premeditated image. Anyway, I'm going to finish up with Fight Club here. Fight Club inspired some imitators, especially in terms of the plot innovation, but the film is most interesting as a summary of all that had been going bad for male white-collar workers and professionals in America since the 70s. Based on a novel of the same name by Chuck Palahniuk, the film tells the story of the mental breakdown of an office worker, played by Ed Norton, who's remarkably similar in gesture and physical appearance to the apartment's C.C. Baxter, whereas Baxter musters the will to resist his superiors. And actually, Fight Club's much more interesting look as a comedy in the way that the apartment's a comedy. So whereas Baxter musters the will to resist his superiors, Norton's character develops a disorder that includes multiple personalities, schizophrenia, and dissociation. Depressed and suicidal, he conjures a doppelganger named Tyler Durden, this is a character played by Brad Pitt, who sets out on a mission to bring capital to his knees. And he forms collectives of dispossessed males and trains them in fight clubs. And these clubs evolve into a paramilitary operation, Project Mayhem, that aims to subvert the U.S. banking industry by destroying the debt record through a series of carefully coordinated bombings of financial institutions. And Durden is everything that Norton, like Baxter, cannot be. And in The Apartment and Fight Club, the protagonists become increasingly conscious of their exploitation and their common cause with other workers. Fight Club powerfully evokes the disenchantment that characterizes young workers in neoliberalism, and it found its fan base really among them. But its association of worker consciousness with paramilitary violence and terrorism was much too radical and kind of randomized in a way for mainstream audiences. And it's remained a cult favorite, which is not surprising given its uncanny symmetry to seeming premediation of events associated with 9/11, for instance, or the financial housing crisis and Occupy Wall Street. And as I say, from that point then, I wander into a variety of other concluding comments, including discussions around race and class. I particularly lean on Adolph's analysis in a piece on nonsite.org called Street Tremés, which is a remarkable essay, and a variety of other his writings to understand exactly that cultural shift, and then that shift over from class-based activism into identity-based and cultural-based sense of identity, or affiliation, and in a certain sense the gutting or the moving away from working class politics. But I conclude, and of course the piece is expanding, and of course after reading all the essays in here, the chapters in here, enormous amount of correction has to go into this piece, but there are amazing crossovers of ideas, and what I'm interested in is that, in fact, it's not as though we are without a language about dispossession and proletarianization. It's just never routinely within the movies in the bodies of working class people, so it's hard to understand them being situated in places that working class folks would actually occupy. But the torment and the stories of dispossession and proletarianization are embodied in these middle class characters, and that's an interesting contradiction, fully ideological, and to that extent absolutely analyzable through a Marxist critical analysis. So I'll leave it at that. It was a real pleasure.